I want you to just picture the reality on the ground right now. It is May 2026. You're in Cuba, and the juxtaposition is, well, it's absolutely jarring.
Yeah, jarring is the right word for it.
Right. Think about the sheer visceral desperation of it. I mean, in the hospitals down there, they are actively suspending critical surgeries. And it's not because of lack of medical expertise or anything like that.
No, the doctors are world class.
Exactly. It's because the power grid is fundamentally failing. Basic supplies, like sterile gloves, anesthetics, they're practically non-existent right now.
Yeah.
You have children going to sleep hungry, quite literally, because the food supply chain is entirely broken.
It's a complete collapse of basic infrastructure.
It is. And that desperation, it isn't just a statistic on a page, you know. It's something you can feel in the heat of the streets or in the dark when those rolling blackouts hit.
Yeah, the human toll is staggering.
But then, and this is the crazy part, while that is happening out in the open, behind closed doors, in these sterile air-conditioned rooms, a massive high-stakes agreement is being negotiated. And it is being negotiated on behalf of those exact same people who are currently sitting in the dark.
It's a profound disconnect. Honestly, it's a chilling one. You have this raw human suffering on one side of a wall, and then cold, calculated geopolitical maneuvering on the other.
Right.
The decisions being made in those rooms right now, I mean, they're going to dictate the trajectory of millions of lives. Yet the brutal irony here is that those millions have absolutely no voice in the process. They're variables on a spreadsheet.
And that is exactly why we are here today. Just to be clear, this is not going to be a quick daily news update. We're not just going to run through the headlines of, what happened yesterday in Havana or Washington.
No, this needs way more depth than that.
Exactly. This is a comprehensive, impartial deep dive into a geopolitical and economic machine that has been operating, evolving, and, frankly, grinding people down for 67 years. Our sources for this are declassified State Department documents, economic analyses, and deep historical records.
We've pulled from a lot of different, highly credible material for this.
We have. And the mission of this deep dive is to answer 3 very specific, critical questions for you. First, why is Cuba in this exact state of prolonged misery? Second, who is actually benefiting from this stalemate?
Because in geopolitics, someone always benefits.
Always. And third, when the ink finally dries on this deal that's being brokered right now, what will the Cuban people truly get out of it?
So, to answer those questions properly, we really have to establish a baseline for our investigation right off the bat. We have to completely strip away the romanticized narratives.
Oh, there's so many of those.
Tons of them. We have to ignore the political talking points from all sides. I mean, the fiery rhetoric of the revolution, the emotional appeals from the exile community, the grandstanding speeches from Washington. We're putting all of that aside today.
Yeah, this isn't about ideology. We are looking strictly at the cold, hard mechanics of power, capital, and control.
Exactly. Because if you want to understand the end game of these negotiations happening right now, you can't just look at the present. We have to rewind over a century.
Right, to the original American blueprint for this entire region. And I think, more importantly, we need to understand why that blueprint works spectacularly well in one place, but completely and utterly failed in another.
That really is the crux of the historical context. It's a tale of 2 very different landscapes. To understand what American capital is trying to do in Cuba today, you have to look at what they successfully did in Florida over a century ago.
Okay, set the scene for us. Florida in 1900.
So look at Florida in the year 1900. You are looking at a virtually unpopulated territory. I mean, we're talking about roughly 500,000 people in the entire state.
Wow.
Yeah. It wasn't the economic juggernaut we know today. It was essentially this massive expanse of swamps, of tropical wilderness, mosquitoes, with just a few scattered, disconnected farming communities.
It is so hard to even imagine that now.
Yeah.
When we think of Florida, we think of, like, Miami, Orlando, massive highways, international trade. But back then, it was empty space.
Precisely. But crucially, beyond just the physical geography, look at the sociology and the politics of Florida in 1900. It completely lacked a coherent political identity.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there were no powerful local elites with entrenched multi-generational wealth and influence. There was no tradition of labor unions organizing workers. There was no intellectual class shaping a fierce national narrative. In every meaningful sense, for the industrialists and the capitalists looking south from New York and Chicago, Florida was a blank slate.
So comparing the U.S. development of Florida to their attempts in Cuba during that same era, It feels like comparing a painter working on a blank canvas to a painter trying to paint over an already finished, highly detailed
I
masterpiece.
really like that analogy.
The canvas just absorbs whatever you put on it.
Let's explore the mechanics of that blank canvas. Because Florida had no organized political body to defend its value or dictate the terms of its development, Northern capital just washed right over it.
Like Henry Flagler.
Henry Flagler's is the perfect example. He brings his railroad down the East Coast, extending it from Jacksonville all the way to Miami between 1885 and 1912. He and other industrialists just bought up massive tracts of real estate for absolute pennies.
Pennies on the dollar.
Exactly. They built the infrastructure, they imported the labor, and the land just accepted it. There was no organized resistance. And in 50 years, that swamp became a cornerstone of the American economy.
But then you take that exact same brush, that exact same model of rapid, aggressive capital expansion, and you try to apply it to Cuba.
And the masterpiece violently resists the new layers. Cuba in 1900 was the furthest thing from a blank slate. It is vital to understand the psychological and sociological makeup of the island at that time.
Because they had a history.
A deep history. Cuba already had a highly educated, deeply politicized middle class. This was a population that had just fought two grueling, incredibly bloody wars of independence against the Spanish Empire.
The first one started in 1868, right? The 10 Years' War.
Yes, and another massive conflict erupted in 1895, and those wars weren't just skirmishes. They forged a very distinct, very proud national identity.
They bled for that identity. They knew exactly who they were before American capital ever showed up.
They absolutely did. They had legendary intellectuals, people like Jose Marti, whose ideas about sovereignty, Latin American dignity, and independence were fundamentally baked into the cultural DNA of the people.
And it wasn't just the intellectuals either.
No, not at all. Beyond the intellectuals, they had a formidable labor union tradition. We're talking about organizations that dated all the way back to the 19th century tobacco workers. These were people who knew how to strike, how to organize, how to demand rights.
Right.
On top of that, they had their own local elites, the criollos. These were native-born Cubans of Spanish descent who had their own competing economic interests, and, they don't want to just hand over their economy to Wall Street.
So the U.S. essentially walks into a buzzsaw of national consciousness. They intervene in 1898, officially to, quote-unquote, liberate Cuba from Spain. And initially they go in with the Teller Amendment, right? This grand, sweeping legislative promise saying, hey, we have no intention of annexing Cuba, we are just here to help.
A promise that evaporated almost the moment the Spanish surrendered. The U.S. military occupies the island, and by 1901, the Teller Amendment is effectively sidelined and replaced by the Platt Amendment.
Let's pause on the Platt Amendment because that sounds like a dry historical footnote.
Right.
But our sources show it's actually the spark that lit the fire. How did it actually work?
The Platt Amendment was just a breathtaking piece of imperial legislation. Washington essentially told the newly formed Cuban government, you can have your constitution and you can have your republic, but you must write the specific amendment into your constitution.
You said what?
It dictated that the United States had the legal right to intervene militarily in Cuba's domestic affairs whenever Washington felt it was necessary to protect American interests or maintain, quote, adequate government.
Wow.
They also forced Cuba to lease them the naval base at Guantanamo Bay indefinitely. It was a massive insult to a population that had just lost hundreds of thousands of people fighting for true independence.
It's essentially saying, you are free, but only as long as you do exactly what we want. And the U.S. didn't just hold that threat over their heads, they actively used it.
Repeatedly, they invoked the Platt Amendment and set the Marines back in 1906, in 1912, in 1917, and intervened politically in 1933.
But this is where the mechanics of power get really fascinating to me. You would think if you are a military superpower repeatedly intervening in a smaller nation, that eventually you'd break their will, you'd wear them down into compliance.
If you're dealing with a population that doesn't have a strong central identity, perhaps. But in Cuba, the exact opposite happened. Every single intervention, every time U.S. troops marched through Havana or protected a sugar mill, it only served to harden Cuban national pride.
The resistance just grew stronger.
Exactly. It wasn't because Cubans were inherently more violent. It was because their entire modern identity was defined by their right to self-determination. Now, to be fair to the historical record, the American economic model did function for a while on the surface.
Right. I mean, it generated a lot of wealth. You had the United Fruit Company controlling vast swaths of agricultural land, especially in regions like Las Villas. You had the American Sugar Refining Company dominating the sugar mills.
They essentially controlled the backbone of the Cuban export economy.
Yeah, and it extended well beyond agriculture.
Huh.
International Telephone and Telegraph ITT, they ran the telecommunications grid. And then, of course, you had the tourism sector.
The massive, glamorous hotels that define that 1950s Havana postcard.
Yes. The Habana Hilton, the Havana Riviera, the Capri. And these were fueled by American capital, heavily intertwined with the American mafia. Figures like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano who ran the casinos.
It looked like an incredible success story if you only looked at the balance sheets of those specific companies or, the photos of American tourists driving convertibles down the Malecon.
Right, the glossy surface.
But that economic integration never translated into political stability. That is the fatal flaw in the 20th century model. Every single Cuban government during that era that tried to serve two masters, the demands of American capital on one side and the fierce demands of the Cuban middle class, students, and labor unions on the other, eventually collapsed under the weight of that contradiction.
You just can't have both.
You cannot have a hyper-exploitative foreign economic model functioning smoothly in a country where the populace is highly educated, deeply organized, and fiercely nationalistic. Fulgencio Batista, the dictator who seized power in 1952, was just the last, most brutal attempt to force that impossible balancing act.
Which brings us to a major pivot point in 1958. This is something from our source documents that rarely gets talked about, and it completely reframes the narrative of the 1959 revolution.
It really does.
The standard story, the one we've all heard, is that Fidel Castro and his guerrilla fighters swept out of the mountains and shocked the world by defeating these deeply entrenched, highly profitable American interests. A sudden communist takeover of a thriving capitalist paradise.
That is the mythology. But the declassified U.S. State Department documents from the time tell a remarkably different story. A story of cold, unsentimental economic calculus.
What are they actually saying?
By mid-1958, months before the revolution actually succeeded, the American business model in Cuba was already fundamentally failing. It was bleeding money.
Wait, really? The standard narrative is that the mob of the corporations were making money hand over fist right up until the day Castro rolled into Havana. Why was it failing?
Several converging factors. First, the American sugar companies were dealing with plummeting international sugar prices, making their massive land holdings less profitable. Second, those Cuban labor unions were incredibly powerful. They were constantly striking, demanding higher wages, better conditions, and a larger share of the profits.
So the cost of doing business was just skyrocketing.
Exactly. Third, the mafia-run casinos were generating cash, yes, but they were also generating a massive public relations nightmare. The rampant corruption, the prostitution, the sheer naked criminality of it all had become politically toxic for the Eisenhower administration back in Washington.
And Batista's heavy-handed tactics were just pouring gasoline on the fire.
Oh, absolutely. Batista's regime was corrupt to a level that was completely unsustainable. His secret police were torturing and murdering students in the streets. That kind of brutality sparks constant, widespread instability.
Right.
Rebel groups were blowing up power lines, burning sugarcane fields, and disrupting transport. So in private, high-level U.S. officials, including the CIA and the State Department, they were actively calculating the costs.
Doing the math.
They realized the financial and political cost of propping up Batista's regime was simply higher than the cost of letting him collapse. So they started cutting off arms shipments to him.
Wait, so they essentially abandoned him?
They did. They didn't support Fidel Castro. They were very wary of him, but they recognized that their economic model in Cuba had reached the end of its viability. They were looking for an exit strategy.
I want to make sure I understand this because it's huge. The U.S. capital exodus that happened in 1959, it wasn't purely a political defeat by a communist uprising. It was the strategic exit of a failed business model that had simply run out of steam.
That is the hard historical truth. But think about the political ramifications of that truth. You cannot go back to Washington or to your shareholders and say, hey, our business model failed because we made bad investments, alienated the local population, and aligned ourselves with a toxic, unstable dictator.
No, that doesn't rally voters. It doesn't build political movements.
So they changed the story.
They executed this brilliant narrative shift.
Exactly. The failure was spun into a narrative of outright theft. The story became, we built a paradise, and the communists stole what was rightfully ours.
Now, to be clear, based on the historical record, The new Cuban government did expropriate those properties without adequate compensation. That did happen.
It did happen. But the context of why those businesses were vulnerable in the first place was totally erased. And that narrative of stolen property is incredibly important.
Because it birthed an entire political industry.
An industry in Miami that has sustained itself for 67 years. The idea of reclaiming that stolen property has generated far more political capital, campaign donations, and careers for politicians in Florida than those actual businesses ever generated in profit during the late 1950s.
Okay, that context is so essential because it tells us that the failure of that 20th century model directly laid the groundwork for the standoff we are looking at today. But when we look at the misery in Cuba right now, in May 2026, the hospitals without power, the lack of fuel, the hungry children, we cannot just write that off as a lingering byproduct of a 60-year-old historical failure. That misery is highly structured. It is a carefully engineered mechanism.
It is a deliberate architecture of control.
Yeah.
And to understand how it functions, we have to dissect it into three distinct layers of pressure: the internal pressure, the external pressure, and the financial anvil hanging over the whole thing. Let's examine the internal pressure first. The Cuban government's engineered scarcity.
This is where I think a lot of people get confused, because the official excuse from Havana is always the same, right? We are suffering because of the U.S. embargo. The blockade is choking us.
Right, that's the official line.
But when you look at the mechanics of how food is distributed inside the country, the scarcity seems entirely by design. Let's look at the libreta, the famous Cuban ration book, which was established way back in 1962.
The official line on the libreta is that it's a socialist triumph, a mechanism to ensure that everyone, regardless of income, gets a fair, subsidized share of food. But if you look at the nutritional math, it is a catastrophic failure.
How bad is it?
The ration book today barely covers 10 to 15 days of basic caloric needs per month for an average adult. You get a few pounds of rice, some sugar, maybe some beans, a tiny amount of cooking oil, and a few eggs if they are available. The rest of the month, you are on your own to figure it out.
If the goal was actually nutrition and food security, they would have abandoned the system decades ago.
Precisely, because its real purpose isn't nutrition, it's total social control. Let's walk through how it actually affects a citizen's daily life.
Okay.
The ration book ties you to a specific local, state-run grocery store, a bodega. You cannot just take your libreta and go shop in a different neighborhood. You have to go to your assigned bodega.
So you're locked in geographically.
Yes. That bodega is directly tied to your specific residential address on your identification card. And that address places you within a specific geographically defined district monitored by the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, which are essentially the neighborhood watchdogs of the Communist Party.
It's like an invisible grid. It just locks you into place.
It is a meticulously designed grid. If you move across town to look for work or stay with a relative without getting through an absurd amount of official bureaucratic permission, which is often denied,
Wow.
you lose your food access.
Wow.
More importantly, if you dissent, if you are seen at a protest, if you speak out against the local party officials, you risk losing your access to the bodega. The person managing the store knows who you are. The CDR president on your block knows who you are.
It's absolute leverage.
By keeping the population perpetually hungry, perpetually on the edge of scarcity, the state ensures that survival itself is tethered to absolute compliance.
But how do we know for sure that this scarcity is an artificial policy choice and not just, the tragic reality of an isolated island economy?
Because history provided us with a perfect control group. We know for an absolute fact that scarcity is a choice because of what happened during the special period in time of peace in the early 1990s.
Right. This was right after the Soviet Union collapse, wasn't it?
Yes. For decades, the Soviet Union had been artificially propping up the Cuban economy, buying their sugar at above market prices and selling them oil at below market prices. When the USSR vanished overnight, the Cuban economy went into free fall.
I've read about that. It was devastating.
The GDP dropped by a staggering 35% in a few years. People were suffering from malnutrition, neuropathy, from vitamin deficiencies. It was desperate.
So what did the government do to fix it?
In a moment of sheer panic, to prevent a mass uprising, the regime temporarily eased its grip. They legalized the U.S. dollar, and most importantly, they allowed free agricultural markets.
Okay.
For the first time in decades, they let independent farmers grow food and sell the surplus directly to consumers at supply and demand market prices, bypassing the state monopoly.
And what happened? Did it work?
The results were immediate and undeniable. As documented by leading Cuban economists, agricultural production absolutely soared. The food supply increased drastically in the cities. Hunger diminished. Prices stabilized because supply met demand.
So it proved that the system could work.
It proved, unequivocally, that the Cuban land can produce, and the Cuban people can produce, if the state just gets out of the way.
But the state didn't stay out of the way, did they?
No, because economic independence creates political independence. A farmer who can feed his family and make a profit without the state doesn't need the state.
Right.
So as soon as the macroeconomic pressure eased, specifically when Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela and started shipping billions of dollars of cheap oil to Cuba in exchange for medical personnel, the Cuban government systematically rolled back those agricultural reforms.
They just shut it down again.
They cracked down on the independent markets, reestablished the state purchasing monopolies, and the scarcity returned. They deliberately chose control over abundance.
That brings us to the ultimate symbol of that control, and probably the most important acronym in this entire discussion, GUNS.
Yes.
The Grupo de Administración Empresarial S.A. This isn't a government ministry, right? It's a massive holding company run by the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. And their grip on the economy is just staggering.
To say they have a grip is an understatement. Estimates suggest GIA controls somewhere between 60 and 80% of the entire formal economy of Cuba. They control the ports, the foreign exchange supermarkets, the gas stations, and crucially, the tourism industry.
And GIA operates in a completely different reality than the average Cuban citizen. I mean, they aren't worrying about the libreta.
Not at all. They run the luxury hotels. They charge tourists in euros and US dollars. They have their own dedicated, heavily protected supply chains for imported food, linens, and building materials.
It's practically a separate country.
And their corporate structure is incredibly opaque. Their bank accounts abroad are often sheltered through complex webs of shell companies, meaning they aren't squeezed by the U.S. financial sanctions in the same way the civilian government ministries are.
So let's connect this back to the visceral scene we opened with. You have this dystopian reality playing out on the streets of Havana right now. GES is running these massive, glittering tourist hotels, places like the Grand Hotel Manzana Kempinski.
Right.
And right now, amidst total municipal grid failure, those hotels have massive private generators humming away. The lights are on, they're serving imported Spanish wine and steaks to tourists, while literally 3 blocks away in central Habana, families are sitting in the dark, the meat in their fridge is spoiled, and mothers are trying to figure out how to feed their kids.
That is the stark reality. And it is vital to understand that this isn't mismanagement or incompetence. That is the system functioning exactly as designed. The military ruthlessly protects its hard currency dollar circuit, while the peso circuit, the one the citizens are trapped in, is allowed to starve.
This internal dynamic is horrifying, but it's only half the story. Because while the Cuban government engineers scarcity from within, the United States is applying tremendous pressure from the outside.
Yes, layer 2.
But looking at the sources, this external pressure doesn't look like a blunt instrument. It's incredibly specific.
It is a highly calibrated operation. Let's examine this external force. The common assumption, the narrative sold to voters in Miami, is that U.S. sanctions are designed to induce a total collapse of the Cuban regime. That maximum pressure means pushing the state until it completely implodes and the government falls.
But our investigation points to something completely counterintuitive. Is the U.S. actually trying to prevent the total collapse of the Cuban government?
From a purely geopolitical, strategic standpoint, yes. The United States needs a functional state apparatus in Havana to negotiate with.
Okay, I have to push back on that because it sounds crazy. Why would the U.S. need a hostile communist regime to survive?
Think about the alternative. What happens if the Cuban state completely collapses into anarchy? If the police stop functioning? If the military fractures into competing factions? If society descends into a failed state scenario just 90 miles from Florida?
It would be chaos.
Absolute chaos. First, you trigger a massive, uncontrollable migration crisis that would dwarf the Mariel boat lift. Second, who does the U.S. negotiate with to secure their interests? A collapsed state cannot sign binding treaties.
Good point.
A fractured nation cannot honor billions of dollars in international debt. It cannot guarantee the removal of the Russian and Chinese intelligence gathering bases that are currently operating on the island. And looking to the future, a state in total chaos cannot provide the physical security necessary to protect future foreign corporate investments. You can't build a Marriott if there are warlords in the streets.
Well, they don't want them dead. They just want them compliant. It's like applying a tourniquet to a limb.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You twist it tight enough to cut off the circulation, tight enough to cause excruciating pain, and tight enough to force the patient to agree to whatever surgery you suggest. But you are deliberately not twisting it so tight that the limb dies and falls off entirely, because you need that limb to hold the pen and sign the paperwork.
The tourniquet analogy is perfect. The U.S. strategy is to keep the Cuban regime desperate enough to accept terms they would otherwise reject out of hand, but stable enough to enforce those terms on their own population once the deal is signed.
And the timeline of the negotiations we are watching right now in May 2026 is a masterclass in how this tourniquet is operated.
It's practically cinematic. Let's look at the dates. Over the past year, the U.S. has quietly but aggressively tightened the sanctions on shipping companies, effectively intercepting or deterring the fuel tankers that Cuba relies on.
Squeezing the supply.
They squeezed the energy grid until it started to break. But in March, they allowed one Russian fuel ship to dock. Just enough to keep the hospitals from completely shutting down, just enough to prevent a total societal revolt that calibrated the pain.
Incredible.
Then the squeeze continued. Finally, on May 13, 2026, the Cuban Minister of Energy is forced to take to national television and declare that the country has literally zero fuel reserves left. Total energy collapse is imminent.
The tourniquet is at maximum pressure. The pain is unbearable.
Exactly. And what happens the very next day? On May 14th, CIA Director John Ratcliffe lands in Havana.
That cannot be a coincidence.
Of course it isn't. It's a highly orchestrated maneuver. You squeeze the life out of the economy, you wait for the exact moment they hit rock bottom and publicly admit they have nothing left, and the very next morning, your chief negotiator walks through the door with the terms of surrender.
So what is the leverage holding this whole thing together? What gives the U.S. the power to dictate terms in that room? That brings us to layer 3, the financial anvil hanging over the island, the 5,913 certified claims.
This is the core of the economic standoff. Back in the early 1960s, after Fidel Castro's government expropriated foreign and domestic properties, the U.S. Department of Justice set up a program. They allowed American citizens and corporations to officially register and certify their losses.
Right.
They meticulously documented 5,913 specific claims of stolen property. At the time, the total value was assessed at roughly $1.9 billion.
Which is a massive sum in 1960. But we were looking at 2026. What is that debt worth now?
This is where we have to discuss the Helms-Burton Act of 1996. That law wasn't just a trade embargo, it specifically weaponized those claims. It allowed for compound interest to be added to the original $1.9 billion at a punitive rate of 6% annually.
Oh, wow.
It also created a mechanism allowing U.S. nationals to sue foreign companies that trafficked in their confiscated property. When you calculate that compound interest over 60-plus years, that original $1.9 billion debt now exceeds $20 billion.
$20 billion. And who holds this debt?
Okay.
We weren't just talking about individual families who lost a vacation home, right?
No, we are talking about massive, multinational corporations with very deep pockets and very long memories. ExxonMobil is claiming over $1 billion just for the Esso oil refineries in Havana and Santiago that were seized in 1960. They have kept teams of corporate lawyers aggressively monitoring this for decades.
And
Marriott International holds the claims for several major hotel properties, including the Habana Hilton, which is now the Habana Libre.
For dark irony there is staggering.
Yeah.
Based on our sources, Marriott currently has, or has recently sought, management contracts with GISA, the Cuban military, to operate hotels in Cuba that previously belonged to their corporate predecessors.
Yeah.
They're literally negotiating with the people who stole their buildings to run the buildings again.
Capital is relentlessly pragmatic. You also have ITT Corporation claiming the massive infrastructure of the Cuban telephone company, which is now Atexa, the state-run telecommunications monopoly. These corporate giants are sitting at the table, or at least looming right behind it. But there's another, perhaps more predatory player in the mix.
The vulture funds.
Yeah.
How do they fit into a geopolitical negotiation?
Over the decades, many of the original exile families who held smaller claims, maybe a sugar mill or a medium-sized factory, grew old. They realized they might never see a dime of restitution in their lifetimes. So, specialized high-risk investment funds swooped in.
The hedge funds.
Exactly. These hedge funds bought the rights to these claims from the desperate or exhausted heirs for pennies on the dollar. They might pay $100,000 for a claim technically worth $2 million with interest. They are playing the long game.
They just wait.
They're betting that eventually a geopolitical deal will be struck, the U.S. will force a payout, and those claims will be activated.
It's a massive high-stakes gamble. But it perfectly illustrates the symbiotic stalemate we are looking at.
Yeah.
The Cuban military regime needs the U.S. pressure and the threat of these claims to justify their domestic control and their narrative of being under siege.
Yes.
And the U.S. needs the leverage of that $20 billion debt to force a future economic transition. They are both operating highly rational, completely ruthless economic strategies.
Which leads us to the ultimate question. What is the transition they are trying to force?
Exactly. If the U.S. is actively keeping the Cuban state on life support with this tourniquet just to get them to the negotiating table, what is the grand vision? What is the blueprint they are trying to make Ratcliffe sign? Because we just spent the first part of this deep dive establishing that they tried to turn Cuba into a compliant blank slate like Florida 100 years ago, and it blew up in their faces. So what is the master plan now?
To understand the 2026 master plan, you first have to understand the illusion that drives the current U.S. administration's thinking. When the Trump administration and key geopolitical figures like Senator Marco Rubio look across the Florida Straits at Cuba, they see a mirage.
What do they see?
They look at Cuba and they see exactly what Florida was before it became a $1.4 trillion GDP powerhouse.
The Florida dream, the ultimate blank canvas.
They see miles of pristine, unexploited beaches ripe for mega resorts. They see the decaying but stunning colonial architecture of Havana, which they believe could be rapidly gentrified into a world-class tourism and real estate hub.
And the agriculture.
They see highly fertile, completely underutilized agricultural land. They see incredible strategic geography right in the middle of the Caribbean shipping lanes. And most temptingly, they see a virgin market of 8 to 9 million consumers who have been deprived of basic consumer goods for decades.
It's a gold mine in their eyes.
They look at all of that and think, we have a second chance. We can finally finish what Flagler and the industrialists started in 1900. We can turn this island into our ultimate offshore enterprise.
It sounds like a real estate developer's ultimate fantasy. But the sources we've compiled make it explicitly mathematically clear that this Florida dream is structurally impossible. It's an illusion.
It absolutely is.
There are 4 massive, unmovable structural roadblocks that guarantee Cuba will never seamlessly integrate into the American economic sphere like Florida did.
And those roadblocks dictate the reality of the negotiations. Roadblock number 1 is the most fundamental: sovereignty.
Okay, unpack that.
Florida is a state within the U.S. Republic. It operates under federal law, the U.S. Constitution, a completely stable currency in the U.S. dollar, and a highly predictable judicial system. If you build a hotel in Miami, the state governor cannot just expropriate it on a whim. Your investment is legally protected by the full weight of the U.S. government.
Right.
But Cuba, regardless of whatever deal is signed with Ratcliffe, will remain an independent, sovereign nation.
And sovereignty introduces risk.
Massive political risk. It means the laws can change. A future Cuban government, perhaps 10 years down the line, could decide the deal signed in 2026 was exploitative and simply tear up the contracts. They've done it before.
Which completely changes the math for investors.
That inherent, undeniable risk fundamentally alters the type of capital that will flow into Cuba. You are going to get safe, long-term civic investment. You're going to get highly aggressive, risk-tolerant capital that demands massive immediate returns to justify the gamble.
Which leads directly to roadblock number 2, the cost of citizenship. If the U.S. really truly wanted to integrate Cuba and eliminate that sovereign risk, they would have to annex it. They would have to absorb 8 to 9 million Cubans into the American system.
And there is less than zero political appetite in Washington for that. Imagine the fiscal shock of giving 9 million people immediate access to federal benefits: Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security infrastructure.
Not to mention voting rights.
Furthermore, granting them voting rights would completely destabilize the American electoral map. No political party wants to take on that unknown variable. If you want proof of how the U.S. handles territorial integration without full rights, look at Puerto Rico.
Oh, that's a stark comparison.
They have been in a devastating territorial economic limbo for 127 years. The U.S. desperately wants the economic access to Cuba's resources and geography, but they absolutely do not want the financial, civic, or democratic responsibilities of actual integration.
Roadblock 3 is geographic, and it's deceptively simple. Cuba is an island. Florida succeeded because it is physically attached to the largest unified consumer market in the world.
Geography dictates logistics. Being an island means supply chain integration, shipping, importing raw materials, exporting finished goods. Everything is inherently more expensive and complicated.
You can't just drive a truck there.
Exactly. You can't just load a freight train in Atlanta and run it straight down to Havana. You have to deal with ports, maritime law, and shipping bottlenecks. It severely limits the types of industries that can be globally competitive there.
And finally, roadblock number 4, which ties directly back to our opening historical analysis, the Cuban temperament.
This might be the biggest miscalculation in the Florida Dream scenario. The Cuban population of 2026 is not the disconnected, unorganized population of Florida in 1900, and frankly, they aren't even the isolated Cuban population of the 1990s special period.
They're highly aware.
They have a deep-seated history of protest. They have an ingrained national pride that survives despite the regime's failures. And crucially, today, they are digitally connected. They have smartphones, they have WhatsApp, they have TikTok.
They know what's going on in the world.
They communicate constantly with their families in Miami and Madrid. They know exactly what their labor, their skills, and their land are worth on the open global market. If a foreign corporation comes in trying to pay them pennies a day, they are not going to quietly accept naked 19th century style exploitation. They will strike, they will protest.
So if the U.S. negotiators are smart, and our sources show they are, they know all of this. They know Cuba can't be seamlessly integrated like a new U.S. state. So are they essentially just settling for a massive offshore enterprise zone?
In a way, yes.
Are they trying to create a system where American corporations get all the economic access and profit of a U.S. territory, but the U.S. government bears absolutely zero of the democratic or financial responsibilities toward the actual citizens living there?
That is precisely the needle they are trying to thread, and they aren't guessing on how to do it. The model for this isn't Florida. The actual functional, proven blueprint they are using at the negotiating table right now is Vietnam.
The Vietnam model.
Yeah.
I want to spend some time on this because when you dig into how it actually functions, it is both fascinating and slightly terrifying in its cold pragmatism.
To understand the logic, think about the history between the U.S. and Vietnam. The United States fought a brutal, catastrophic war there. Millions of Vietnamese lives lost. Tens of thousands of American lives lost, massive societal upheaval. It was an existential ideological conflict.
Yeah.
But look at Vietnam today, specifically looking at the decades after diplomatic relations were normalized in 1995. Today, Vietnam is a massive, thriving manufacturing hub for the global capitalist economy. Nike manufactures a huge percentage of its shoes there. Samsung produces its cutting-edge electronics there. Foreign capital flows in and out with very little friction.
And yet, politically, nothing changed. The Communist Party of Vietnam is still entirely in power. They never fell.
Exactly. There are no competitive free elections. There is no political pluralism. Human rights organizations regularly criticize their crackdowns on dissent. But Wall Street doesn't care because the factories run on time.
It's all about stability.
The U.S. learned a crucial, cynical lesson in Vietnam. You do not need to defeat a communist regime politically or militarily if you can successfully integrate them economically. The U.S. is perfectly willing to let the Cuban Communist Party, or whatever corporate evolution GISA turns into, survive and manage the transition.
The ideological compromise there is staggering. Generations of politicians have yelled about bringing democracy to Cuba, but behind closed doors, Washington does not care if Cuba ever has a free election, provided the regime ensures a docile labor force and doesn't interfere with the free flow of capital.
No, they don't.
It's an economic victory they are seeking, not a democratic one.
That is the hard truth of geopolitics. Stability for investors always trumps democracy for citizens.
So we apply the Vietnam template to the Cuba of 2026. What does that actually look like on the ground? Paint that picture for us.
It looks like a highly segmented, hyper-capitalist enclave managed by an authoritarian state. It looks like Marriott securing lucrative 99-year management contracts directly with JSA to run the luxury hotel sector, splitting the profits with the generals.
Wow.
It looks like ExxonMobil signing production sharing agreements with the state oil monopoly to drill for deepwater oil off the northern coast of Cuba. It looks like American biotech firms licensing cutting-edge, highly effective Cuban medical research like their Simovax lung cancer vaccine, which is world-class, and bringing it to the highly profitable U.S. healthcare market.
And the gig economy part too, right?
And, perhaps most insidiously, it looks like Elon Musk's Starlink, providing the high-speed internet infrastructure necessary to plug the highly educated Cuban population into the global gig economy as a source of cheap, remote digital labor.
Which brings us to the most critical and perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this entire investigation. If this Vietnam-style corporate integration is the endgame, We need to follow the money.
Let's follow it.
When the ink finally dries on Ratcliffe's agreement, how exactly does the wealth get divided? Who actually gets what?
Let's map out the distribution, starting at the top of the food chain. The claimants in the vulture funds holding that $20 billion debt. The precedent for how this payout mechanism will work comes from the post-Soviet transitions in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, places like Poland and the Czech Republic.
Okay, how did that work?
The reality of time and infrastructure makes physical restitution impossible. You cannot give the Habana Libre Hotel back to a specific family when a state apparatus has run it, renovated it, and altered it for 60 years, and when thousands of other people work and live in connected properties.
It would be a legal and logistical nightmare, so they don't get the physical buildings back.
No. Instead, they will likely get a negotiated financial settlement. Typically, in these international tribunals, claimants get somewhere between 10 and 30% of the assessed value of their claim. And they won't get it in a giant lump sum of cash. They will get it paid out in long-term state bonds backed by the new revenue streams or through priority access to new investment opportunities. So ExxonMobil might not get its 1960 refinery in Santiago back, but they might get hundreds of millions in sovereign bonds, plus the exclusive untendered rights to those new offshore drilling blocks we mentioned.
But the real winners here, the ones who are going to make an astronomical profit, are those vulture funds we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Because of the math of distressed debt. If a hedge fund bought a claim from an exhausted exiled family in 1995 for 10 cents on the dollar, and the U.S.-Cuba geopolitical deal negotiated by Ratcliffe pays out at 30 cents on the dollar, that fund just tripled its investment.
And they are doing this on a multi-billion-dollar scale.
They will make an absolute fortune for simply holding a piece of paper for 30 years.
Meanwhile, the original exiled families, the people who actually lost their homes, their businesses, the people who fled on boats or planes, the ones who sold out early out of desperation or medical bills, or simply a loss of hope.
They get nothing. They get to watch Wall Street hedge funds cash in on their grandfather's lost farm. It is a massive upward transfer of wealth.
It's ruthless. And what about the other side of the table? What about GISA? What happens to the generals and the party elites who've been running the machinery of misery for decades? Do they get purged?
Not at all. They get the golden parachute. The Cuban military brass will undergo a transformation identical to what happened to the KGB and the mid-loved Soviet officials in Russia in the 1990s.
You become oligarchs.
They become the new oligarchs. American corporations like Marriott or agricultural giants like Cargill are not going to try to bypass the entrenched power structures. They are going to partner with them. The generals take off their olive green uniforms, put on Italian suits, and transition to the boardroom.
Just to change of clothes.
They keep their accumulated wealth, they keep their domestic influence, and they legitimize their power globally by becoming the indispensable middlemen who manage the foreign capital and keep the local labor force in line.
I want to synthesize this because it's a staggering realization. This whole geopolitical settlement, wrapped in the language of diplomacy and progress, sounds exactly like a ruthless corporate merger.
That's exactly what it is.
The military executives get the board seats and the stock options, the activist Wall Street vulture funds make a killing on the buyout, and the regular employees, the citizens who kept the country running through decades of hardship, just get a new ID badge, a slightly better company cafeteria, and the exact same minimum wage.
Yeah, that's incredibly accurate.
Which brings us to the most important group, the Cuban people. We have to strip away the spin. What is the reality check for the average citizen in this deal?
We have to be brutally honest here about what they will get and what they will not get. Because the changes will be visible, but deeply unequal. Let's start with what they will get. They will get electricity, eventually. Foreign capital requires a stable grid to operate hotels and factories, so the energy infrastructure will be modernized and stabilized. The rolling blackouts will end, they will get access to consumer goods, the store shelves will no longer be empty.
But there's a massive, crushing catch to those full shelves.
Yes. The goods will be sold at global market prices. So an average Cuban family living in a crumbling apartment in Havana might walk into a newly opened retail store and see everything they've been dreaming of. Beef, modern appliances, clothing. But they won't be able to afford any of it on a local salary.
So they can see it, but they can't touch it.
Exactly. They will also get jobs, but mostly low-tier service and assembly jobs. You will see an acceleration of a situation that already exists in Cuba, where a bellhop at the newly managed Marriott makes more in a single day of tips in foreign currency than a highly trained, state-employed surgeon makes in an entire month. The agreement will put that disparity on steroids.
And as we mentioned, they will get Starlink, uncensored internet.
Yes, and we will come back to why that specific piece of infrastructure is the one genuine wild card in this whole scenario. But first, let's look at what the Cuban people will unequivocally not get from this deal.
They will not get their original properties back. The homes confiscated in the 60s that are now occupied by 2 or 3 other Cuban families, those are going to be tied up in complex legal purgatory. But mass evictions of the current residents are practically impossible without sparking a civil war.
More importantly, and this shatters the illusions of many observers, they will not get competitive free elections anytime soon.
Right.
As we established with the Vietnam model, the Communist Party, or whatever it rebrands itself as, will remain in absolute control to guarantee stability, security, and predictability for the foreign investors. Washington won't demand elections if the profit margins are good. And finally, they will absolutely not get economic equality.
The inequality gap is going to explode, isn't it?
Yeah, look at Vietnam again as our predictive model. After the U.S. normalization, cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City experienced a massive, visible economic boom. Skyscrapers went up, luxury car dealerships opened, and a new, highly affluent middle and upper class emerged, mostly tied to the party or foreign business.
But the rest of the country?
The rural areas, the agricultural provinces, were left far behind in grinding poverty. Vietnam developed one of the highest levels of income inequality in all of Southeast Asia. That is the exact future mapped out for Cuba. The divide between those with access to foreign currency through remittances from Miami, tourism jobs, or government connections, and those stuck in the local peso economy will become an unbridgeable chasm.
Which forces us to look at the most uncomfortable truth of this entire deep dive. If the wealth is being systematically divided up between Wall Street vulture funds, American multinational corporations, and Cuban military elites, who is actually fighting for the Cuban people at the negotiating table? Who is their advocate?
The hard, undeniable truth is nobody. We have to confront the reality of how political constituencies actually work. Take a prominent figure like Senator Marco Rubio. He is incredibly vocal about Cuba. He makes passionate speeches about freedom and democracy.
Right.
But we have to look at his incentives. As a United States Senator from Florida, his ultimate obligation, his true constituency, is not the residents of Havana or Pinar del Rio. His obligation is to his voters in Florida and, crucially, to the political donors and investment funds that back his campaigns.
Wait, I have to challenge that assumption. Isn't there a massive political risk for politicians in Florida? If they push through or support a deal that clearly sells out the Cuban democratic dream, the dream of free elections and liberty, just to satisfy corporate interests and vulture funds, won't their own voters in Miami, the exile community, turn on them in fury?
You would logically think so, but political narratives are highly malleable. When the deal is finally announced, it will absolutely not be framed as a sellout to Wall Street. It will be masterfully spun. It will be sold as a pragmatic, hard-fought victory. Politicians will stand at podiums and say, look, we forced them to release the political prisoners. We broke the blockade. We got American businesses back in there to spread our values. Democracy and freedom will naturally, inevitably follow the free market.
Even though the historical evidence from Vietnam and China proves that free markets do not automatically create free societies.
Exactly. That fact will be conveniently ignored because ultimately the system is insulated. Cubans living on the island cannot vote in U.S. elections. They cannot hold Senator Rubio or any U.S. official accountable at the ballot box because they were never truly their representatives. Their suffering is a talking point, not a voting bloc.
So look at the actual negotiating table right now in Havana. Look at the balance of power. The regime elites, the generals, they are highly organized. They know exactly what they want to survive the crisis, maintain control, and get rich in the transition. And they are negotiating ruthlessly with CIA Director Radcliffe to get it.
And the people who actually want freedom, the independent artists, the dissident journalists, the exhausted citizens banging pots and pans in the streets during the midnight blackouts, they do not have a seat at that table.
No.
They aren't even allowed in the building. They have immense moral authority, which is powerful, but they have absolutely zero institutional or economic leverage in those closed-door meetings. International relations at this level are driven by cold, calculated interests, not morality.
This highlights what might be the ultimate tragic trap of the last 67 years. The danger of blind hope. Waiting for foreign actors to save the day. Whether they are waiting for Donald Trump to apply maximum pressure or Marco Rubio to legislate freedom, or even the Pope to negotiate a miracle waiting for outsiders, is a fatal miscalculation.
It really is.
Because relying on foreign powers means handing the future of the island over to the interests of those powers, which are ultimately interests like ExxonMobil and Marriott. Real, systemic, lasting change only happens when the people inside the island realize that the country belongs to them, not the military and not foreign investors, and they find a way to act on that realization.
Until that realization translates into actual internal leverage, like a general strike or a massive coordinated civic movement that actually disrupts the economic machinery, the negotiations will continue to treat the Cuban people as a variable to be managed, a labor force to be priced, rather than a constituency to be served.
Let's bring all of this together, because we've covered an immense amount of ground. We started by looking at the stark, painful contrast between the starving hospitals and the high-stakes negotiations happening right now. We traced how the failure of the original American economic model in 1958 led directly to a 67-year standoff, fueled by a manufactured narrative of stolen property that became a political industry. We exposed how scarcity, the empty shelves, and the ration books are used as deliberate, engineered tools of control by the Cuban government.
And then layer 2 and 3.
Right. We saw how the U.S. calibrates its blockades like a tourniquet, applying just enough pressure to force compliance without causing total collapse. And we mapped out exactly how the current negotiations are driving towards a Vietnam-style client state, where military oligarchs and foreign corporations divide the spoils, while the Cuban people are handed low-wage service jobs and market-rate goods they cannot afford.
It is a sobering, heavy reality check. It strips away the comforting illusions we've been fed for decades.
It does. And it brings us to the defining takeaway of this entire investigation. If you are listening to this and you remember nothing else from this deep dive, remember this phrase. When this deal is done, the Cuban people will get electricity. Eventually. And the owners of Florida will get Havana.
And it is crucial to understand that stating this isn't pessimism, it isn't cynicism, it is simply reading the math.
Right.
It is what the evidence of $20 billion in certified claims dictates. It is what an economy where 80% of the wealth is controlled by the military dictates. It is the inevitable mathematical outcome of a negotiation between the architects of American capital and a desperate authoritarian regime.
But there's one piece of this puzzle that doesn't quite fit the control grid, the one wild card we mentioned earlier. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. As part of this grand corporate integration, to make the gig economy work, the Cuban people will get Starlink.
Yes, the internet.
They will get uncensored, high-speed, decentralized internet. It is the one part of this mega deal that neither the U.S. corporations nor the Cuban government can fully control once it is unleashed into the population. So ask yourself, could the digital connection of 8 million historically resilient, completely disenfranchised people ultimately become the Trojan horse?
It's a huge question.
Could the very infrastructure that foreign capital is bringing in to exploit the population be the exact tool the population uses to organize, rise up, and dismantle the entire system?
That is the one variable no one in those closed-door meetings can fully predict. And it might be the only thing that changes the math.
We will keep watching. Until next time, keep digging.